I'm divorcing my husband, I said into the microphone. And for the first time in 12 years, Ethan Caldwell forgot how to smile. A crystal chandelier glowed above us. Champagne glasses hovered in frozen hands, and nearly 300 of Manhattan's wealthiest guests stared as though someone had just rewritten reality in front of them. Minutes earlier, they had expected another flawless charity gala hosted by the city's favorite millionaire couple. They expected polished speeches, generous donations, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Instead, they watched a 7-month pregnant wife calmly end a marriage worth more than most companies. The silence that followed felt heavier than applause ever could. No one knew why Ethan's face had drained of color. No one knew why his attorney suddenly stood up from the front table and quietly walked toward the exit. And absolutely no one knew what was waiting inside the sealed envelope resting beneath my hand. They thought the divorce announcement was the surprise. It wasn't. It was only the door to something far bigger. My name is Claire Bennett, and before this night was over, the man everyone admired would discover that losing a marriage was the smallest problem he was about to face. 6 months earlier, I would have laughed if someone had told me I'd become the headline of every business network in America. I lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. My calendar revolved around charity boards, prenatal appointments, and dinners where everyone complimented our perfect life. Every magazine called Ethan and me the power couple who had everything: wealth, influence, respect, even our first child on the way. Looking back, I realize perfection is often the most convincing disguise. People rarely question a beautiful picture. They simply frame it and move on. That's exactly what Ethan counted on. He knew how to shake hands with senators, laugh with investors, and remember the names of every waiter in the room. He also knew how to look directly into my eyes every morning and tell me everything was fine. I believed him because trust doesn't disappear all at once. It fades quietly, one unexplained meeting at a time, one canceled dinner at a time, one phone turned face down at a time. The changes were so small that each one seemed harmless by itself. Together, they became impossible to ignore. Friends asked if pregnancy had made me more emotional. My mother insisted successful men simply worked longer hours. Even I tried convincing myself that nothing was wrong. After all, people don't abandon a life they've spent years building because of a feeling they can't prove. Then something happened that changed the way I looked at every conversation we'd had over the previous year. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't lipstick on a collar or perfume lingering in the air. It was something so ordinary that almost anyone else would have overlooked it completely. Yet the moment I saw it, every missing piece began fitting together with terrifying precision. I said nothing. I asked no questions. I cried where no one could see me, then quietly began preparing for the only conversation that truly mattered. By the time Ethan realized I had stopped believing his version of our marriage, I was already 3 moves ahead, and the envelope resting beneath my hand tonight contained the first clue to a truth he never imagined I would uncover. The first crack in our marriage did not sound like an argument. It sounded like a voicemail. Ethan had canceled our anniversary dinner for what he called an emergency meeting with investors in Boston. His voice was calm, confident, almost rehearsed. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I even smiled as I deleted the message, telling myself there would always be another dinner, another celebration, another chance to reconnect before the baby arrived. At 7 months pregnant, I had become an expert at making excuses for someone else's choices. The following morning, he came home carrying an expensive bakery box from a place nearly every New Yorker recognized. He kissed my forehead, apologized again, and handed me my favorite lemon pastries. Most wives would have seen a thoughtful husband trying to make up for a missed evening. I almost did. Then I noticed something strange. The receipt tucked inside the box showed the purchase had been made at 7:30 the previous night. The problem was not the time. The problem was the location. The bakery was less than 4 blocks from our apartment. Boston was more than 200 miles away. I stared at the tiny piece of paper longer than I cared to admit. It would have been easy to confront him immediately. Instead, I quietly folded the receipt and slipped it into my planner without saying a word. That single decision changed everything. Over the following weeks, I stopped searching for explanations and started paying attention to patterns. Ethan never realized the difference. He continued leaving before sunrise with perfectly pressed suits and returning after dark with stories that always sounded polished enough to survive casual questions. Every answer arrived too quickly, almost as though he had practiced them during the drive home. I stopped asking follow-up questions. That made him comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. One Tuesday afternoon, my obstetrician suggested I spend less time on my feet because my blood pressure had begun creeping higher than normal. I sent Ethan a message asking whether he could join me for the next appointment. He replied within seconds, promising he would move every meeting necessary because our daughter came first. 20 minutes later, his assistant called to apologize. Apparently, he had already committed to an all-day executive retreat scheduled months in advance. Both stories could not be true. Again, I said nothing. Instead, I thanked her for the information and wished everyone a productive meeting. She sounded relieved. I suspect she never knew she had become the first person to accidentally tell me the truth. By then, I had started noticing smaller details that no longer felt random. His wedding ring disappeared during business trips, then quietly returned before he walked through our front door. He protected his phone with a new password, even though we had shared everything for years. He smiled at messages while insisting they were from investors in different time zones. Every explanation seemed reasonable until I placed them side by side. Suddenly, the picture changed. Friends still envied our life. Social media showed elegant dinners, charity events, and smiling photographs beneath glittering skylines. Every image looked perfect because perfection was exactly what Ethan wanted the world to see. Meanwhile, I began creating a private collection that no one else knew existed. A receipt, a calendar entry, a canceled reservation, an airline confirmation that contradicted another itinerary. None of them proved anything by themselves. Together, they whispered a story that refused to stay hidden. And deep inside, I realized I was no longer trying to save my marriage. I was trying to understand who the man beside me had become before he realized I had already begun uncovering the truth. Once I stopped looking for dramatic proof, the truth became surprisingly ordinary. It lived inside schedules, receipts, forgotten details, and conversations that no one thought mattered. I kept every piece inside a plain leather notebook that never left my side. Anyone who opened it would have seen grocery lists, baby names, and doctor appointments. Hidden between those pages were copies of boarding passes, restaurant confirmations, and handwritten notes that slowly transformed confusion into certainty. Ethan never noticed because he had stopped paying attention to the quiet parts of my life. He assumed pregnancy had made my world smaller. In reality, it had sharpened my instincts. One afternoon, I attended a luncheon hosted by the Children's Foundation where Ethan served on the executive board. He introduced me with the same charming smile that had once made me believe I was the luckiest woman in New York. He rested one hand gently on my shoulder while telling donors how excited he was to become a father. Cameras flashed. People applauded. Several guests commented on how devoted he seemed. I smiled for every photograph because sometimes the most dangerous place to reveal the truth is the moment everyone expects happiness. Across the ballroom, I noticed a woman I had never met before. She was elegant without trying too hard, confident without appearing arrogant. Ethan greeted dozens of people that afternoon, yet his expression shifted almost imperceptibly when his eyes landed on her. Most people would never have seen it. I did. It lasted less than 2 seconds before both of them looked away. Nothing inappropriate happened. No whispered conversation. No lingering embrace. Just a glance that carried the weight of familiarity. Her name tag read Sophia Grant. I memorized it without writing it down. Later that evening, I casually asked Ethan whether the event had introduced him to any interesting new business partners. He listed 6 names. Sophia was not one of them. The omission spoke louder than any explanation he could have offered. Days later, I searched public records about the foundation and discovered Sophia had joined its advisory committee nearly 8 months earlier. According to Ethan, he attended every quarterly planning session. Somehow he expected me to believe he had never mentioned someone who appeared in nearly every group photograph posted online. I still refused to accuse him. Instead, I quietly observed. The more patient I became, the more confident he grew. Confidence creates routine, and routine leaves trails. Every Thursday, he scheduled what he called strategic leadership dinners. Those dinners always ended around 9 o'clock according to his calendar. Yet his driver consistently logged the return trip after 11. I learned that by calling the transportation office under the harmless excuse of confirming arrival times for insurance paperwork before the baby came. Nobody questioned a concerned, expectant mother. They simply answered my questions. Every answer became another page in my notebook. Then came the moment I could not explain away. One rainy afternoon, a courier delivered a garment bag addressed to Ethan. He was still downtown, so the doorman brought it upstairs. I signed for it without thinking. The attached tag listed a hotel ballroom where a private event had been held the previous weekend. Ethan had told me he spent that weekend in Chicago negotiating a commercial property deal. Curiosity overcame hesitation. I called the hotel pretending to verify whether my husband had accidentally left something behind. The receptionist politely informed me that the ballroom had not hosted a business conference at all. It had hosted an exclusive engagement celebration. She apologized for not being able to release guest information. She did not realize she had already revealed more than enough. I ended the call with steady hands, but inside something finally changed. I no longer feared discovering the truth. I feared how carefully it had been hidden, and I understood that whatever waited at the end of this story would reach far beyond a broken promise. The receptionist's words echoed in my mind for days. An engagement celebration, not a corporate negotiation, not an investor dinner. An engagement celebration. The strange part was not that Ethan had lied. By then, I had accepted that deception had become part of his routine. The part that unsettled me was how completely he believed I would never look beyond the story he handed me. That assumption hurt more than the betrayal itself. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing me as the woman he married. He saw a quiet wife waiting at home, preparing a nursery and counting baby kicks while he managed the important parts of life. He had forgotten who I had been before I became Claire Caldwell. Years before anyone called me a millionaire's wife, I had built a career that most people in our circle never even knew existed. I graduated near the top of my class at Columbia Law School and spent 6 demanding years as a corporate litigation attorney representing Fortune 500 companies in complex financial disputes. My job was never about dramatic courtroom speeches. It was about details, hidden transactions, conflicting timelines, tiny inconsistencies that revealed much larger truths. I had built a reputation on seeing patterns that other people ignored. When Ethan proposed, we made what seemed like a mutual decision. He wanted to expand Caldwell development across the country, and I wanted a family more than another promotion. I stepped away from the firm believing I was investing in our future together. My former partners respected the decision, although several warned me never to lose the part of myself that loved asking difficult questions. I smiled and promised I never would. Somewhere between charity galas, board dinners, and decorating our apartment, I almost forgot that promise. Ethan certainly did. He introduced me as a homemaker, a philanthropist, an expectant mother, but never as an attorney. Eventually, everyone accepted the version of me he presented. Even Sophia probably believed she was dealing with someone who had never read a financial disclosure or analyzed a contract. That misunderstanding became my greatest advantage. Instead of confronting Ethan emotionally, I approached the situation exactly as I would have approached one of my former corporate investigations. Every claim required verification. Every explanation required independent confirmation. Every timeline needed supporting evidence. Emotion could wait. Facts came first. I reopened an old email account that I had not accessed in years and reached out to someone I trusted completely, Rebecca Hayes, one of the sharpest family law attorneys in Manhattan and a former colleague from my litigation days. She replied less than 15 minutes later with a simple message. Coffee tomorrow. Bring everything. We met in a quiet cafe before sunrise while the city was still waking up. Rebecca listened without interrupting as I placed my notebook on the table and carefully walked her through every receipt, reservation, calendar conflict, and phone record I had collected. She never rushed me. She never dismissed a detail as insignificant. When I finally finished, she closed the notebook, looked directly at me, and asked one question. Claire, are you trying to save your marriage, or are you trying to protect your future? I looked down at my wedding ring, then instinctively rested my hand on my daughter's steady movement beneath my coat. The answer surprised even me. I am protecting my daughter. Rebecca nodded slowly, as though she had expected exactly that response. She slid the notebook back across the table and quietly explained that evidence was only valuable if it was gathered legally, carefully, and patiently. She advised me not to confront Ethan, not to change my daily routine, and not to let him suspect that anything had changed. The truth has a strange habit she said before we stood to leave. When someone believes they are completely safe, they usually reveal far more than they ever intended. As I stepped back onto the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, I realized something important. I was no longer reacting to Ethan's decisions. For the first time in months, I was making my own. From that morning forward, Ethan believed he was living inside the same marriage. The only difference was that I had stopped filling the silence with trust. Instead, I filled it with preparation. Rebecca introduced me to a licensed forensic accountant named Daniel Mercer, a quiet man whose entire career revolved around tracing financial patterns that people assumed no one would ever question. We met in a modest office several floors above a law firm in Midtown, far away from the polished conference rooms where Ethan usually conducted business. Daniel explained that he did not need access to private accounts to begin identifying inconsistencies. Public filings, corporate disclosures, real estate transfers, charity records, and executive compensation reports often revealed far more than people realized. I handed him copies of everything I had legally collected. He reviewed the documents without making dramatic comments. Every few minutes, he placed another page into a separate folder labeled Timeline. After nearly 2 hours, he leaned back, removed his glasses, and quietly said something that changed the direction of the entire investigation. "Claire, I think your husband has been preparing for something much longer than you have." Those words stayed with me during the drive home. I had assumed I was responding to a recent betrayal. Daniel believed Ethan had been quietly rearranging pieces long before I ever noticed the first missing dinner. Over the next several weeks, Rebecca and Daniel worked independently while I continued living exactly as Ethan expected. I attended charity lunches. I smiled through fundraising photographs. I toured pediatric clinics and selected paint colors for our daughter's nursery. Every evening, Ethan returned home, believing his carefully balanced double life remained untouched. He even became unusually attentive. He brought flowers without being asked. He insisted on joining me for evening walks through Central Park. He surprised me with a handcrafted rocking chair for the nursery. Months earlier, those gestures would have melted every doubt I carried. Now they felt strangely timed, as though he sensed an invisible shift without understanding its cause. Then Rebecca called with news that made everything clearer. Through publicly available corporate records, Daniel had discovered several newly established limited liability companies connected to commercial properties that had quietly changed ownership over the previous year. None of Ethan's name appeared directly on the paperwork. Instead, the companies traced back through multiple management entities before ultimately connecting to someone unexpected: Sophia Grant. The discovery alone did not prove misconduct, but it revealed a relationship far deeper than casual friendship. Rebecca remained cautious. She reminded me that assumptions destroy good cases. Facts build them. We needed patience, not anger. A few days later, Ethan announced that Caldwell Development would host its largest annual charity gala in less than 3 weeks. Nearly every major investor, board member, and media outlet in New York would attend. He spoke enthusiastically about the event during dinner, describing it as the perfect opportunity to strengthen the company's public image before several important expansion projects. I smiled and congratulated him. Inside, another idea quietly began taking shape. Later that night, Rebecca called again. Before I could say hello, she asked a simple question. "Has Ethan mentioned the gala?" I looked toward the dining room where he was reviewing financial presentations on his tablet and answered yes. She paused for a moment before speaking again. "Good. Then I think we have our stage." Her choice of words caught my attention immediately. Stage. Not courtroom. Not negotiation. Stage. She explained that the truth carries its greatest weight when people cannot quietly rewrite it afterward. Public statements create public consequences. Public documents become impossible to deny. If everything continued unfolding the way Daniel expected, the gala would gather every person whose opinion mattered most to Ethan in one room at exactly the same time. For the first time since this journey began, I understood why every piece of evidence had seemed to arrive so slowly. We were never collecting random facts. We were building a timeline that would speak for itself. And when the final page found its place beside all the others, the envelope waiting inside my desk drawer would no longer contain questions. It would contain answers that Ethan would never see coming. The ballroom lights reflected across polished marble as though nothing in the world could disturb the perfection surrounding us. A string quartet played softly near the grand staircase, while waiters moved effortlessly between tables carrying sparkling water and silver trays of carefully prepared appetizers. Investors laughed with governors. Television anchors rehearsed introductions near the stage. Every detail had been planned to celebrate Caldwell Development's biggest charitable initiative of the year. Ethan stood near the podium greeting guests with effortless confidence. Every handshake reinforced the image he had spent years creating. Successful, generous, untouchable. He looked at me from across the room and smiled exactly the way he always did whenever cameras appeared nearby. I smiled back. By then, pretending had become easier than explaining. Rebecca arrived 20 minutes before the opening remarks wearing a simple navy dress that made her look more like another donor than one of Manhattan's most respected family attorneys. Daniel entered separately a few minutes later, blending quietly into the crowd beside several financial executives who already knew him professionally. Neither of them acknowledged me directly. That had been our agreement from the beginning. Nothing about tonight could appear coordinated until the precise moment it needed to be. As guests settled into their seats, Ethan stepped onto the stage beneath a wall of glowing screens displaying the foundation's annual achievements. He thanked sponsors, praised community volunteers, and spoke warmly about family values, responsibility, and building a legacy for future generations. The audience responded exactly as expected. Polite laughter, generous applause, admiring smiles. Listening from my table near the front of the ballroom, I realized something unexpected. His speech was genuinely inspiring. That made everything infinitely more heartbreaking. The man standing beneath those lights possessed every ability to become the husband I believed I had married. He had simply chosen a different path. When the applause faded, the master of ceremonies announced a short video presentation before dinner service. That was our opening. Rebecca glanced toward me only once before giving an almost invisible nod. My heartbeat remained surprisingly calm as I stood and walked toward the stage. Several guests assumed I had been invited to introduce the foundation's maternal health initiative because of my pregnancy. Cameras immediately turned in my direction. Ethan smiled confidently and reached out to help me onto the platform. "Everyone," he said warmly into the microphone. "My wife has a few words she would like to share." He had no idea how accurate that statement would become. I accepted the microphone with steady hands and waited until the room became completely silent. The enormous screens behind me still displayed photographs of smiling families supported by the foundation. I looked across the audience and recognized board members, judges, journalists, longtime friends, and nearly every executive whose opinion mattered to Ethan's future. Then I turned toward him. His expression remained relaxed, almost proud. "Thank you," I began quietly. "Tonight was supposed to celebrate honesty, commitment, and the promises we make to other people." Several guests nodded politely. Ethan smiled. "That is exactly why I cannot remain silent any longer." His smile faded almost imperceptibly. I rested one hand gently over my daughter's steady movement beneath my evening gown and continued speaking with the same calm voice I had practiced dozens of times. "As of tonight, I am formally ending my marriage to Ethan Caldwell." The room froze. No one moved. Even the musicians lowered their instruments. Somewhere in the distance, a champagne glass touched the marble floor with a soft, unmistakable sound. Ethan stared at me as though he had misunderstood every word. Before he could speak, I placed a sealed envelope onto the podium beside the microphone. "Inside this envelope," I said evenly, "are documents that explain why this decision became necessary. Every page has already been reviewed by legal counsel." Across the ballroom, I saw Rebecca quietly stand. At another table, Daniel closed his notebook. Ethan reached instinctively toward the envelope, but I rested my hand over it first. "Not yet," I said softly enough that only the nearest microphones carried my voice. Everyone deserves to hear the truth in the right order. And for the first time that entire evening, I watched genuine panic replace confidence in my husband's eyes. No one spoke. 300 people sat perfectly still, caught between curiosity and disbelief, while Ethan stared at the sealed envelope as though it had suddenly become the most dangerous object in the room. He finally reached for the microphone, forcing a laugh that sounded unfamiliar even to him. "Claire is under a great deal of stress," he said with a careful smile. "Pregnancy has been difficult, and I think tonight may not be the right time for a personal conversation. A few uneasy chuckles floated through the ballroom before disappearing just as quickly. Nobody seemed convinced. I looked at Ethan for a long moment before answering. "You are right about one thing," I said calmly. "This is personal. But when someone builds a public reputation on trust, integrity, and family, the truth eventually becomes public as well." I stepped slightly aside and nodded toward the audiovisual technician near the back of the room. Rebecca had already spoken with him earlier that evening under the Foundation's authority to update presentation materials. He pressed a single key. The smiling family photographs vanished from the massive screens. In their place appeared a simple timeline. No accusations. No dramatic headlines. Just dates, locations, and publicly documented events. The audience leaned forward almost instinctively. I pointed toward the first entry. This was the evening of our wedding anniversary. Ethan informed me he was meeting investors in Boston. The next line appeared beneath it. "This receipt, obtained legally from my own home, places him in Manhattan less than 4 blocks from our apartment at the exact same time." A quiet murmur swept across the ballroom. Ethan immediately interrupted. "That proves absolutely nothing. Plans changed." I nodded. "Correct. By itself, it proves nothing." Another slide appeared. This was the executive retreat Ethan said prevented him from attending our daughter's prenatal appointment. The following document appeared beside it. It was a publicly available event schedule from Caldwell Development showing that no executive retreat had taken place that day. Instead, the company's calendar listed individual departmental meetings held inside headquarters. Several board members exchanged confused glances. One elderly investor quietly removed his glasses and studied the screen more carefully. Ethan's phone began vibrating against the podium. He ignored it. Seconds later, it vibrated again. Then again. Around the ballroom, other phones began lighting up as reporters quietly searched company records and compared dates in real time. I never raised my voice. I never accused anyone of anything beyond what the documents themselves demonstrated. Every page you are seeing tonight comes from public records or materials legally available to me. I explained. I am not asking anyone to believe my opinion. I am asking you to look at verified facts. Rebecca stepped forward only after I finished speaking. She introduced herself simply as my legal counsel and confirmed that every document had been independently reviewed before the event. She did not discuss allegations. She discussed procedure. That distinction mattered. Across the room, Daniel remained seated, saying nothing at all. His silence carried its own authority. Ethan looked towards several board members as though expecting someone to rescue him. Instead, the chairman slowly stood. He was a retired federal judge whose reputation for careful decision-making had guided the company for more than a decade. He spoke only one sentence. "Mr. Caldwell, I believe the board should convene immediately after this event." Ethan's expression changed again. For the first time that evening, he understood the problem was no longer limited to our marriage. Reputation moves faster than facts, especially in a room filled with investors responsible for billions of dollars. Then another phone vibrated. This time it belonged to Sophia Grant. She glanced at the illuminated screen, her composure finally slipping before she quietly stood and walked toward a side exit. She never looked back. Ethan noticed. So did everyone else. The ballroom remained almost completely silent as the doors closed behind her. He whispered her name under his breath without realizing his microphone was still live. The sound echoed through the speakers with painful clarity. Nobody gasped. Nobody shouted. They simply listened. Sometimes a single unguarded word reveals more than an hour of explanations ever could. And I knew, standing beneath those bright ballroom lights, that the hardest part of the evening had not even begun. The chairman's request changed the atmosphere more than any document ever could. Moments earlier, the ballroom had been filled with polished conversations and carefully practiced smiles. Now, every whispered exchange carried a different question. What else had not been disclosed? Investors were no longer watching a family crisis. They were evaluating risk. That difference mattered. Ethan understood it immediately. He stepped away from the podium and lowered his voice as though the room had suddenly disappeared around us. "Claire," he said quietly, "we do not have to do this here. We can go home and talk." The words almost sounded sincere. Almost. Months earlier, I probably would have accepted them without hesitation. Tonight, they felt strangely empty because they arrived only after the truth had become impossible to ignore. I looked at the wedding ring still resting on my finger. It had once represented promises. Now it represented memory. I slowly removed it and placed it beside the unopened envelope on the podium. The sound of metal touching polished wood was barely audible, yet dozens of heads turned toward us. I wanted to have this conversation at home, I answered softly. I wanted to have it on our anniversary. I wanted to have it before our daughter ever had the chance to grow up wondering why honesty disappeared from our family. You made those conversations impossible. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, he had no prepared answer. Before anyone else could interrupt, Rebecca addressed the room once more. She clarified that legal proceedings would continue through the appropriate courts, and that no conclusions should be drawn beyond the verified documents already presented. Her professionalism restored a sense of order that emotion alone never could. Several journalists quietly lowered their cameras. This story no longer depended on dramatic images. The facts would speak for themselves over the coming weeks. One by one, members of the board approached the chairman rather than Ethan. They spoke in hushed voices while reviewing electronic copies of public records that had already begun circulating among their legal advisors. Nobody accused him of wrongdoing. Nobody declared guilt. Instead, they asked questions that responsible directors are expected to ask whenever trust becomes uncertain. That realization seemed to affect Ethan more deeply than anything I had said. His influence had always rested on confidence. Confidence cannot survive unanswered questions forever. My phone vibrated inside my handbag. It was a message from Daniel. Only 4 words appeared on the screen. The filings are public. I understood immediately. Earlier that afternoon, additional corporate disclosures had officially become accessible through state records exactly as he had anticipated. The timing was no longer ours to control. Anyone with an internet connection could verify them independently. The truth had moved beyond private conversations and entered the public record. Ethan's attorney returned to the ballroom carrying a tablet and quietly whispered something into his ear. I watched the color leave Ethan's face once again. He glanced toward me, not with anger this time, but with the unmistakable expression of someone realizing that every possible exit had slowly disappeared long before he noticed the walls closing around him. "Did you plan all of this?" he asked. I shook my head gently. "No, I plan to protect my future. Your own decisions created everything else." The distinction seemed to settle over the room with unexpected weight. This had never been about revenge. Revenge seeks suffering. I had spent months seeking clarity. There is a difference. I picked up the sealed envelope and handed it directly to Rebecca. "Please file everything tomorrow morning," I said. She nodded without opening it. The envelope had never been intended as a dramatic reveal. It was simply the final step in a process that had already begun. I turned toward the ballroom doors and paused only once. Behind me, I could hear board members organizing an emergency meeting, reporters quietly confirming public records, and guests speaking in measured voices rather than excited whispers. Ethan remained standing beside the empty podium, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet somehow more isolated than anyone else in the room. At that moment, I finally understood that the greatest loss he faced was not financial uncertainty or public scrutiny. It was the irreversible moment when trust quietly walks away and never chooses to return. The cool night air felt different the moment I stepped outside. Manhattan had not changed. Yellow taxis still rolled past the hotel entrance. Office windows still shimmered against the dark skyline. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed through the city before fading into the distance. Yet everything inside me had become quieter than it had been in months. Rebecca caught up with me just beyond the revolving doors, holding the envelope securely beneath one arm. She did not ask whether I was all right. She already knew the answer was complicated. Instead, she smiled gently and said, "You did exactly what you came here to do." I looked down as my daughter shifted beneath my hand. For the first time since learning the truth, her movement no longer reminded me of uncertainty. It reminded me of the future. My phone vibrated again. This time it was not another legal update or a message from Daniel. It was my mother. Only one sentence appeared on the screen. "Come home. We are waiting for you." I had not realized until that moment how desperately I needed the simple comfort of the word home. Behind us, the ballroom doors opened briefly as several reporters hurried outside, speaking into cameras while producers relayed breaking updates through their headsets. None of them called my name. None of them chased after me. Their attention remained fixed on the building behind us, where board members continued their emergency meeting and attorneys quietly reviewed documents that would shape the weeks ahead. That felt strangely appropriate. My story had never been about becoming famous. It had been about finally becoming free. Over the following months, the legal process unfolded exactly as Rebecca had predicted. Every issue was handled through the proper courts with professionalism and patience. Public filings replaced rumors. Verified records replaced speculation. Independent reviews answered questions that emotion never could. Some business partners chose to distance themselves from Ethan, while others waited for additional information before making their own decisions. That was their right. Reputation, I learned, is not destroyed in a single evening. It changes one choice at a time, just as trust does. I never celebrated his losses because they were no longer my purpose. My responsibility was preparing for the life waiting ahead. Several weeks later, our daughter entered the world surrounded by calm voices, caring nurses, and the quiet reassurance of people who genuinely wanted the best for both of us. As I held her for the first time, I realized something that no courtroom, board meeting, or public statement could ever provide. Peace does not arrive when someone else finally understands your pain. Peace arrives when you stop allowing their decisions to define your future. A few months after that, I returned to practicing law on a limited basis, focusing on helping families and small business owners navigate difficult transitions with dignity instead of bitterness. My first framed diploma hung once again inside my office, reminding me that the woman I thought I had left behind had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. Occasionally, I would see photographs of Ethan attending public events or read short business articles mentioning changes within Caldwell Development. I never felt satisfaction. I never felt resentment. I simply closed the article and continued with my day because some chapters deserve to stay exactly where they belong, in the past. One crisp autumn afternoon, I pushed my daughter's stroller through Central Park beneath trees painted gold and crimson. She laughed at the falling leaves while sunlight filtered gently through the branches overhead. No cameras followed us. No audience applauded. No one recognized the woman quietly enjoying a peaceful afternoon with her child. And somehow, that ordinary moment became the richest one of my life. Looking back now, I understand that people often believe wealth is measured by penthouses, luxury galas, or successful companies. They are mistaken. Real wealth is waking up each morning without fear of the truth. It is raising a child inside a home built on honesty instead of appearances. It is discovering that dignity, once reclaimed, never needs anyone else's permission to exist. Some people spend years protecting the image they created for the world. Others choose to protect the values they want their children to inherit. In the end, only one of those legacies survives.